Okay, I'm going to try this again. This is my third time recording this. Sorry. Anyway, this is Dr. Nelson again. I'm going to try to keep this shorter because I know these get a little long. Today I want to talk about the scientific revolution and the simultaneous event of witch crazes. These two things happened really pretty much at the same time, mid 1500s through the 1600s. And we want to look at these through nature, basically. Views of nature um, affected science and religion. And as those views of nature changes, we see two different reactions. I'm doing this a little bit through the lens of Harry Potter. I originally did this as a lecture many years ago at the public library for an exhibit they did. And it was really for kids, so we did a lot of Harry Potter. But I've kept a version of this in my Western Civ class ever since. And so I thought this year would be perfect to do this with Scotland since we're talking quite a bit about Harry Potter. Of course, Harry Potter is about witches and the pursuit and prosecution of witches by muggles. And if you think of Hogwarts, of course, there's a lot of nature involved. But they also go to school to learn about science. And so it sort of is a perfect lens. And J.K. Rowling, who, of course, is really English but was writing in Scotland and still lives in Scotland. And Harry Potter is very English, but it's also, as we'll see, very Scottish. In fact, to some degree, you could argue Harry Potter might even be more Scottish than English. She's clearly influenced not only by superstitions and stories, but also by British history. And I think that's very clear into the scientific revolution. When we're in Edinburgh, we'll see a lot of her influences, including some of the places she wrote, such as the Elephant House. It's not the only place she wrote, but it's the place most famous um, for where she wrote, and it's located right across the street from the National Library of Scotland. We'll be visiting there. Some of the sites we'll see that that influenced her, things like the James Harriet School. If you take this school and combine it with Edinburgh Castle, less than a mile away, you have Hogwarts, which is the school where all the wizards went to learn about science and magic. Because again, in the book, they're the same thing. And before the 1500s, in some ways, they were seen as the same thing as well. Today, when you look at Britain, whether England, Wales, or Scotland, the image is nature, peaceful, restorative, a gentle country. No snakes, no hurricanes, no tornadoes, no alligators, no bears. Nothing's going to hurt you. No poisonous insects or anything. A gentle country. Rolling fields of heather and nice hedgerows and lots of green. And a lot of us probably grew up reading British literature for kids, like Winnie the Pooh and the Hundred Acre Woods, or Alice and all these talking animals in Wonderland, or Beatrice Potter and her wonderful little animals. Of course, she's from northern England, the Lake District, which is influencing her writing. Even the fantasy writing, such as J.R.R. Tolkien, the first modern fantasy writer. Um, and The Hobbit and later Lord of the Rings. I mean, it's all about nature and magical creatures. And of course, nature is presented as a nice thing, as a peaceful thing, unless bad guys come in and think Harry Potter and Voldemort or Muggles. If you look at, again, most guides to Britain or Scotland or England or Wales, I mean, again, they focus on the nature. If they do look at the history, it's history that's almost been overtaken by nature. Now, in the 1500s and up to the 1500s, nature wasn't seen in the same way. And of course, up until the 1500s, they didn't have modern science. I mean, they weren't fools. But at the same time, they had a lot of superstitions, things, ways of explaining the world that made sense to them. That tell us what makes sense anymore. For instance, if you're sick, that meant your body was imbalanced. Doctors would look at your feces or your urine or smell you or they might order you to be bled. Now, of course, they wouldn't do that. Doctors weren't supposed to actually cut you or take blood out of you. So you had to go to a barber, and a barber would then bleed you into a bowl like this one. You knew it was a barber because there would be white rags, bloody white rags hanging in front of the store, which has evolved into the modern barber pole that you still see occasionally today. Um, and of course, by the way, very quickly, I've talked about this before, but, medical practices would have been very magical thinking as these creatures here. There was a thought that doctors would tell you not to eat vegetables or fruit. That's too animal-like. If you're obese, sit in the sun. That will make you healthier. Um, again, purging you to make you better. Um, Doctors would warn if you die not to let any dogs or cats step over your coffin because you might turn into a vampire. If your left eye isn't closed properly, you might wind up in purgatory. Um, if you saw a shooting star, that could mean death. If you have 13 people at dinner, that might mean someone's going to die that night. By the way, the number 13, which, again, it's funny to make fun of these people today. It's so easy to go, oh, can you believe they used to believe that stuff? And yet, people still fear the number 13, which more than likely comes from the story of the Last Supper and Judas being the one who betrays Jesus, the 13th member. Friday the 13th. Friday has always been seen as an unlucky day. And so when 13 and Friday come together, it's doubly unlucky. Um, I remember working as a cashier, and if something rang up $6.66, people would always buy something else because they didn't want 666 to be on their bill. Not that numbers can actually control us. We still read the astrology. People still read their horoscopes. They look at fortune cookies. So we still have our superstitions today, but nothing like people back then used to believe. Everything from ogres to leprechauns. I mean, to them, nature was full of magic. Nature was scary, but it was also something that you had gone towards. I mean, if you were a commoner, a farmer, a peasant, you would have lived near nature, and you would have looked towards nature as a place for answers sometimes, and you would have seen beyond Christianity. You would also seen other stuff out there. Fairies in England, it would have been fairies would have been small and female. In Scotland, they could be male and could also be quite big and scary. A daub would be a household spirit, like an elf. I mean, they would have believed in elves as well. Um, uh, Dobby is a hob, for instance. Then you also have hobnobs. You also have brownies in Scotland, which later get transplanted as an idea to Canada. Gnomes were in England and Scotland. And of course, a lot of these early beliefs come out of what we call pagan beliefs. Pagan really just means country folk. It's from a Greek word. It just means people in the rural area. And of course, their beliefs would become pagan beliefs. By the time of the 1500s, pagan meant non Christian. It could also mean non Jewish or non Muslim. In other words, you didn't believe in the God of Abraham, you believed in some other gods. And so Roman and Greeks would have been pagan. And a lot of those Roman and Greek gods would over time evolve into other types of gods as well. And we still see that heritage today. Um, Tuesday is Tewe, which is also Mercury, the messenger god. Thursday is Thor Day. You see him there on the right. Um, Saturn, Saturday is Saturn Day for the god Saturn. Wednesday is Odin's Day or Woden's Day. Woden was a Norse god, a Viking god. You see him pictured there on the right. He's also the basis of Santa Claus, by the way. That's where we initially get the idea of Santa Claus from. Friday is Freya's Day, Athena, in other words, the goddess of love. Then, of course, Sunday and Moon Day, Sunday and Monday. So we still see that heritage of this pagan past. Um, by and large, people weren't necessarily pagans by the time of the 1500s, but they still had elements from these pagan beliefs that would have survived as superstitions and such. Of course, there's also mythical creatures like dragons, which so many cultures believe in. We're not sure why. Maybe dinosaur bones. Maybe. Of course, Harry Potter had his dragons. Even St. George. St. George is where we get the flag for England. It's the St. George Cross, although he's not actually English. It's from an old legend of a person who went to a village and they had a dragon. They wanted this knight to slay the dragon. He said he would if they would become Christians. They did, and he did. Could be from we're not sure, it's more likely just made up, but there is some thought that maybe this was a missionary into Africa. And maybe it was actually the killing of a crocodile. In fact, this might be an African story originally that was picked up by Europeans. A lot of people forget that. The Church of Ethiopia, which was a Christian church, was huge. It was as big as the Catholic Church of Europe. Um, and there's the St. George flag, right there, the English flag. Of course, you look at the writings of the 15 and 1600s, people like Shakespeare with Macbeth, the Scottish play, another legend in itself, by the way. If you're in theater or an actor, you're not supposed to say Macbeth. You call it the Scottish play. Of course, there's the witches and Macbeth, Midsummer Night's Dream, full of fairies and other magic creatures. Hamlet, I mean, this incredibly serious drama. And yet, right in the middle of it, a ghost shows up and starts talking. Seems odd today. You couldn't imagine The Godfather or, Amistad or Schindler's List, suddenly a ghost appearing. But yet he appears in Hamlet. And of course, at that time, people believed in ghosts and such. Maybe not Shakespeare, but it would have been something that audiences would have believed in and understood. So, throughout the thousands, up till, you know, late 1500s, the view of the natural world was at least the elite view, the church view, the scientific view, what you would have learned if you went to university, was that nature was satanic. It was pagan. It was not Christian, in other words. It was not civilized. It was evil. It was wild. The people who live in the woods, such as Native Americans or people in the peripherals of society, they would be savages. In fact, the word savage comes from the word silva, which means wood. Civilization, for instance, meant to transform nature. What made us human is we took woods and we took plants and we took wild animals and we made farms and livestock and houses and books. We transformed nature. We're not of nature, we're above nature. Nature needs to be controlled. And even our nature inside of us needs to be controlled through the commandments, through God, through the law. We even today we ascribe our lesser qualities to animalistic qualities. Um, Also, the idea of nature was there for us. The animals, the plants, they're there for practical use, food or tools, aesthetic use, birds sound pretty, flowers smell good, or for moral reasons. We see nature and we see how not to act. Now, again, your common person believes this, but they also believe in some of the superstitions and even saw nature as a place to go. It's interesting, this view of nature for man's use and such. From a modern viewpoint, we can see a lot of elements of it that we would reject today. You don't have to be a member of PETA to think something like bear baiting, where a bear, again, is tied to a pole and then is beaten and baited till it gets really angry, and that would have been pleasurable. You don't have to be a member of PETA to think that's not good, or cockfighting, which sadly, along with dogfighting, still goes on today. And of course, cockfighting goes until one kills the other one. Um, and a lot of royal houses, including the Tower of London, kings and queens would bring in elephants and tigers and bulls and cows and elephants and bears to kill each other. I mean, that was considered pleasurable. It was not unheard of to torture animals for 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 entertainment. Now, where does this view of nature come from for Europeans? Because not all cultures believe this. A lot of cultures had a much more cooperative relationship with nature. But in Europe, there was a very strong divide, and we can really see this going back to creation. God created the earth for man. Now, of course, the idea at that time was that Earth was 6,000 years old. James Ussher from Oxford came up with this. He actually was Irish, but he worked at Oxford. And he, going through all the begets and the lifespans of all the people in the Bible, he figured out that Earth was just over, actually at that time, just under 6,000 years old. Today it would be over 6,000 years old if he was right. And that would have been a very common view. He was the first one to come up with this, but many people, including many scientists like Isaac Newton, would come up with their own ideas, and they would be very, very similar. Now, of course, the idea is God in 7 days created everything, and on the sixth day created man, and then on the seventh day he rested. Adam was created. A little bit later, his rib was taken to create Eve. And Eden was a paradise. Some people think that the whole idea of Eden is more of a symbolic place, that is not an actual physical place, that is more of a metaphor. But people in the 1500s would have believed it was, in 1600s, would have believed that it was real, a real place, where there was no murder, no shame, no sin. People lived forever. Animals and humans only ate plants. There was, again, no fierce creatures, no violence. And there's only one rule: don't eat from the tree of knowledge. And it technically doesn't actually say apple, just a fruit from the tree of knowledge. And one day, a serpent, um, today we tend to interpret that as the devil, but a serpent convinces Eve to eat one of the fruit. then she does and convinces Adam to do this, and then God shows up and says, "Okay, everyone out of the pool, put your clothes back on. You're done. You're finished." And of course, from that point on, they knew sin. Um, they knew shame. They were now mortal. They weren't immortal anymore. And fierce creatures come about. And of course, the snake, which can be incredibly fierce if you get a poisonous snake. It's interesting that the snake has always been portrayed as evil. And again, you think Harry Potter, and Voldemort, and Slytherin. I mean, and the parcel tongue and all that. Anyway, now time goes on. Of course, the children of Adam and Eve, the first two children, actually, one kills the other one, Cain and Abel. So, man is now sinful. It's the original sin, and of course, the female, as far as Europeans were concerned, were to blame for that. It was her fault. Hence, painful childbirth, a monthly curse. Actually, I have family members that still call it the curse, which is, of course, the menstrual cycle. Now, after a while, the descendants of Adam and Eve populate the earth, and then they go off and do some things that God doesn't like. This is the Old Testament. This is the God. This is the mean God. This is the wrathful God. And he decides to take revenge, to start over, like a big cosmic eraser. He's going to get rid of everything and start again. So he goes to Noah and he says, collect 2 of each animal on a big boat. I'm going to kill everybody else. Your family will live, everybody else won't. So he gets 2 of everything. 2 horses, 2 turtles, 2 roaches, 2 snakes, 2 bats, whatever. And then for 40 days and for 40 nights, which today we just simply interpret that as a long time, it floods. And here's some very graphic medieval period depictions of what the flood might have looked like. People dying, drowning, babies, grandmothers, animals. Of course, after this period, the flood stops, the water recedes, and Noah's family and those animals repopulate the earth. And at that point, Europeans say that humans began to have dominance over the natural world again. Not perfect dominance, but they do have dominance again. In fact, as Genesis says, and this is God talking to Noah, the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth. Every moving thing that live shall be for you. And scientists of the 15 and 1600s, including people like Newton, would argue that what you do through science is to further reestablish that dominance of man over nature. Now, so that's kind of the viewpoint. And science is there, but at the same time, there's a sense that you don't really mess with nature. It's really not worth dealing with. It's satanic, it's paganistic, it's out there. The devil, the serpent, is in nature. So you don't just study animals or plants at that time, only if you had to. That begins to change, again, with 2 things. One is the Protestant Reformation, which puts fear into a lot of people, and that also is spurred on by the discovery of the New World. This literally a new world which changes everything. A place that nobody knew about. New animals, new people, new plants. And it's that catalyst. Just like it was a catalyst for splitting up of the church, it was also a catalyst for new ideas. You just began to think of things in a different way. And it also changed views about nature as well. And also, as I said, brought a lot of fear. What is this new world? Shakespeare, for instance, deals with this new world. He portrays the new world as a dangerous place. I mean, in the movie, eventually a movie, the play The Tempest, which is basically a retelling of the Roanoke colony, a failed English colony in North Carolina. Caliban, this animalistic human, is basically supposed to be Native Americans. It's interesting how Europeans viewed the New World. It was a double-edged sword. In some ways, it was a hopeful place. This was a chance to start over, maybe a new Eden with these innocent, childlike creatures, as Bartolome Las Casas described them as, a Spanish missionary. But others saw this new world as a dangerous place, as an uncontrolled place, as a satanic, paganistic place. And it was literally pagan. In other words, there were people there that worshiped gods that weren't the God of Abraham, so they technically were pagan. And some people thought that these people clearly must be worshiping the devil, because some people thought that any other gods were just a devil in disguise. Some people thought that they were ignorant of Christianity, so therefore innocent. Other people argued that God would not have created these people and forgotten about them. So they must have known about God and Christianity. And since they are clearly not Christians, they are therefore satanic. By the way, this image that you're looking at, as a Floridian, I have to do this because this is Florida Indians. It's the very earliest depiction of Native Americans. It was done in 1564. There's about 37 of these. You see them in every textbook by a guy named Jacques Lemoyne, a French explorer. This particular image, though, has the originals have gone away, and what we see today are copies of those in the 1590s. But these are Timucuan Indians in North Florida and South Georgia. And of course, as a person who went to FSU, the Florida Seminoles, I have to show a picture of the FSU, the Seminoles, the Indians killing a gator, since our big rival, the Florida Gators. The discovery of the New World, in addition to spurring on the Protestant Reformation, also spurs on something we today call the scientific revolution. Yeah, it's always hard to date where does the scientific revolution begin, and what, of course, it really is a whole bunch of people individually starting to come up with new ideas. So part of this is spurred on by the New World. Some of it's already going on, though. We talked earlier about the fall of Constantinople, the takeover of that city, Eastern Roman Empire, by the Muslims, and the discovery not only of Muslim ideas, of things like algebra and astronomy, but also the discovery of Greek and Roman texts, and that begins to get some of these naturalists, as they used to be called, scientists, in other words, to think about new ideas. One of the earliest of these guys is Copernicus, who's Polish, who comes up with a new way of looking at the heavens. Of course, the original viewpoint is that Earth is the center of the universe. God created us at the end, and everything revolves around us. We are the apple of God's eye. But looking at how the sun and the stars, and they knew of about 5 planets, how those things moved around, they realized they don't seem to fit. But it does work. Those observations work if the sun is the center of the universe. Muslims actually are the first one to propose this, by the way. If the sun is the center of the universe and we all go around the sun, and of course then the earth spins on its axis, then that seems to explain everything. A heliocentric universe. A little bit later, between 1609 and 1618, Johannes Kepler is looking at those 5 planets that they were aware of, and their satellites, in other words, moons. And he was looking at how they move. And he was trying to come up with ideas to explain, because they don't seem to be perfect circles, which if God was the one making all this happen, because the old idea was the planet, the sun, and the stars are moved through the sky by angels and literally by the hand of God. Well, Kepler shows that these things actually move in an elliptical way, and they seem to move a little bit faster the closer they are to the sun, which now we know has to do with gravitational pull. He's starting to look at natural laws, in other words, and that there may be other explanations for some of this stuff. However, it was Galileo, an Italian, who really made this reality. He using improved telescopes, he began to realize that Kepler was right and Copernicus is right. He also was looking at the moon and saying, look, that moon isn't perfect. It's not perfectly smooth. There's craters in it. It's clearly been smashed. It's had a violent history. And he really proves these ideas, which the church and a lot of great thinkers of the day were very appalled at this, because it would mean we're not necessarily the center of the universe, and that might mean God has other priorities other than us. And of course, some people might have even taken it further and might have even questioned creation. Galileo would have been very religious, but he was hauled in front of the Pope as a heretic. He did recant, but at the last moment, according to legend, he said, "Yet it moves," meaning the sun moves, the earth moves. And he was under house arrest until he died. And he wouldn't be forgiven by the church until 1991. So the scientific revolution, as we today call it, that name doesn't even come about till the 1930s, by the way. Looking back at the past, they wouldn't have called it a revolution at the time. We can really date this as a real revolution, really to London, England. But clearly, it's going on all over Europe, including Scotland. But a couple of revolutionary ideas. The world was not necessarily created just for us. There's plenty of other stuff going on, and there's a whole universe out there. And Earth is not the center of that universe. There's also discovery of a whole other world. In addition to the New World of the Americas, there's also this whole other world, this microscopic world, that again we have nothing to do with. It seems to have nothing to do with us. And there's also this shift. Again, today we don't really care. This doesn't seem to bother people today, but this shift from God as the prime mover to natural laws. That things can be explained without necessarily the big giant hand of God making it happen. And this will start to lead to new ways of thinking that leads to the Enlightenment, which will be the last lecture I put up online. Let me give you a good example of how different this time period was and how much this has changed. We talked last time about the wars that are going on over religion and over national competition. But by the mid-1600s, that's ending. And in England and Scotland, we see the Royal Society, created by Charles II. Quick reminder, remember there was King James VI of Scotland, one of the Stuart families. In 1603, he becomes the King of England. In Jamestown, for instance, is named for him. His son, Charles, becomes king then, and then his grandson, Charles, becomes Charles II. So this is Charles Stuart, so still a Scottish king. He creates the Royal Society, which again is a place to pursue science. It still exists today, by the way. And there is a Royal Society of Edinburgh created a few years later. Free thinking, open competition. Here is part of the charter, the language that Charles II used. He said that this would consist of men of different religions, countries, and professions. Their job is not to lay the foundation of an English or Scottish, Popish or Protestant philosophy, but a philosophy of mankind, which again is incredibly modern, going beyond religious, cultural, or national boundaries. And this group would be the leader of the scientific revolution. I mean, in a way, it's the embodiment of the revolution. A few years later, he creates the Royal Observatory to help do better observations of the heavens, to keep time, to try to establish longitudes so we have better ideas of maps. It's also where we get our modern measurements. The yard was supposed to be from your nose to the end of your finger. A foot was your foot. An inch was the knuckle of your index finger. But of course, everybody's different, so this begins to standardize measurements, which is key to understanding science. You have to do that. Now, speaking of the Royal Society, I think two of the figures most related to the scientific revolution were both presidents of the Royal Society. One was this guy, Robert Hooke. Now, this is probably not what he looked like. When Isaac Newton became president of the Royal Society, he had the painting of Hooke thrown out. And so later it was redone. And so this is the redone painting. Now, Robert Hooke did most of his work with microscopes. This was really his work. He's the one that discovered this whole new world. This is his drawing of a flea. And of course he ends up creating a book called Microphagia, which is, again, looking at this micro world. And it's the beginning of microbiology. But he also wanted to go further. He was looking at how light works, how gravity works, but he knew he didn't have the math. So he spurred on his rival, Isaac Newton, to begin looking at these ideas. Now again, Isaac Newton and him did not get along, but Newton had the better math. So it's like Hooke was the thinker here, the idea man, and Newton was, the guy that actually made it happen. Newton was a very private, devout person, spent most of his time at Cambridge, a little bit, came to London a few times, again eventually becomes the president of the society. Finally, in 1687, publishes his Principia, which is often looked upon today as kind of the beginning of modern science, although there's clearly other stuff going on. But theories of gravity are in here, and like the beginning of physics, the beginning of calculus, all of that's in here. This is again a huge leap as far as science. Hooke's not in here though. He should have been, but his ideas aren't here. He doesn't get any credit. In a letter to Hooke, Isaac Newton says what seems to be very humble. He says, "If I have seen further than others, it's only by standing on the backs of giants." But that's actually a very mean comment to Hooke, because Hooke actually had a hunchback. He suffered from kyphosis. So now, once knowing that, you realize that was actually kind of a mean statement that Newton was making. Now, one thing about these guys, today we very much praise these guys, and in many ways we should. But at the same time, again, these scientists were just as superstitious in some ways as others. Even the Microphagia was celebrated as not only the first book to use the word cell, but also a book that celebrated a world without sorcery and superstitions. And yet, these same guys believes things like hens sit on an odd number of eggs, or that toads will have a jewel in their head. That's why a lot of toads used to be killed. And the biggest thing that a lot of these guys would have believed is alchemy. This is considered the magnum opus, the big project. This is what they were all aiming towards. Of course, it's usually described as trying to find a way to turn lead into gold. But it's more than that. They're looking for the purest element, the philosopher's stone, from which you can figure out all the secrets of the universe, including immortality. And if that sounds familiar, Harry Potter. The first book is called Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Again, Rowling knows her history. And that seems shocking today, but at the same time, you and I are guilty, and I said this before, you and I are guilty of having superstitions. We say something's jinxed, we knock on wood, we say bless you after somebody sneezes. Of course, you say bless you because I used to believe that a demon came out of your nose when you sneezed, and if you blessed a person, the demon won't go back in their nose. And yet, nobody believes that, yet we still say those things. A Scottish writer, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of the first superhero, if you will, Sherlock Holmes, the greatest rational thinker of all time. And of course, Doyle could be as fooled as much as the rest of us. He believes in these cotton-leaf fairies, which these two young girls took photos of. Here's one of them. And they're clearly fake. That's clearly not real. But he believed it. In fact, there's a great interview with him with the BBC in the late 1920s before he died. And they asked him about this. Why do you believe in the fairies? And he kind of laughs. He says, "My dear boy, there's a vast difference between believing in something and knowing something. I know there are fairies." And of course, looking back, he seems ridiculous. But again, people today believe in things, alien abductions and conspiracies. This was a hoax that a special effects artist tried to do a few years ago to prove that there were really fairies. Even today, people in Scotland and Ireland will still profess belief in fairies. By the 1700s, studying nature for its own sake was considered a legitimate practice. Studying plants and animals. And again, getting back to the idea of controlling nature, there's very much a sense of that. Some people see this as almost sad, that there's a sense of taking the literal magic out of nature and controlling it and putting everything in its box, such as Carl Linnaeus's taxonomy. And we still use it today. He tries to, long before Darwin, he's trying to look at the relationships of plants and animals and categorize them accordingly. A kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Which is still what we use today. And there on the right side is us: Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia, primates, Hominidae, Homo sapien, which is us. That's our relationship. We're animals. We have backbones and spines. Chordata. We're mammals. We're primates within the mammals. Where those primates are specifically hominids, and we are the part of Homo, which go back to Homo erectus and Homo Neanderthals, and we're sapien, which, by the way, Homo sapien means wise man, which I always think is funny. It's like saying my name's Dave Nelson. It means genius. It's not a very humble name for us. Anyway. And here's his. It's interesting, all cultures do this, by the way. In fact, they do it in the same way. Plants, animals, insects, fish. And most of them use two names, binomial. There's actually a name for doing this. It's called Umwelt. It's actually a German name. This impulse to name and classify things. And we all do it in our own way. Anyway, enough of that. Now, in the same time that there is a science, there's folk wisdom and magic. Magic, by the way, all it really means is to control nature, which is sort of science in a way. You do something, you say something, you wave your hand, you wave your wand, and something happens. That is magic. And this is a way to, superstitions and magic were ways to explain the world, control the world, predict things. You'd have blessings, rituals, folk remedies. Some of these would have been legit, others not so legit. And we'll talk about a lot of these when we're in Scotland. A lot of these will come up when we talk about witch trials. Now, by the way, most people know about the black cat, but the top image, this is found in Scotland and in Ireland. These were called headache stones. You would go and you put the stone on your head, and your headache would go away. Um, but I have the term Jesus magic here, and this is a Protestant term. Protestants, in particular, really didn't like these things. They found these things very, what they would call popish, very Catholic. But the Catholic Church was also beginning to worry about this stuff. Originally, this stuff was seen as innocent in the same way today. Who cares if you read the horoscope? But after the Protestant Reformation and the churches are splitting up and we're fighting over that, now some people are beginning to wonder if allowing this kind of stuff, because again, anything outside of God really is, it's blasphemous if you really get strict about it. And a lot of people thought, well, maybe this stuff is really satanic in the end. But anyway, Jesus magic. This is the idea. For instance, at one time you had invited the priest to your field to bless it, maybe sprinkle holy water on it, with the idea you'll get good crops. You do something, something happens. That's magic. That's not Christianity. So it's Christianity, but it's a magical version of it, Jesus magic. And a lot of people who didn't understand Christianity, a lot of illiterate people who didn't speak Latin, didn't really know what they were doing. For instance, they do communion, they hear hocus meum, this is my body, and they think, well, good things happen, so I'll go somewhere else and I'll say hocus pocus and think it's the same thing. And both the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches became concerned about this. So by the late 1500s and into the 1600s, these folk beliefs began seen as magic. All of it's magic. Some of it would have been magic, some of it would have been other stuff. Now it's all magic, and all magic is bad. It's satanic. It's evil. It's of the devil. And so we need to stamp out magic. So things that were, again, considered innocent just 100 years earlier now are considered bad. And we used to say millions. Now we know that's probably too large of a number. But definitely thousands and thousands and thousands of people were killed for being witches. Men and women, although it's about a 5-to-1 ratio of women over men. In some areas, it's as many as 20 to 1. Scotland and Germany, by the way, two worst places. Also the two places where the Protestant Reformation were sort of the strongest. England, on the other hand, actually didn't have it too bad. Even though all the movies about witchcraft always take place in England, actually, not that many witches were killed in England, but in Scotland, a lot. And we'll talk about that while we're over there. Now you might think, why would people do witchcraft? Even though they wouldn't have called it witchcraft, at the time. You would have gone to a cunning woman, or a wise woman, or a wise man. I mean, in the Bible, the Christmas story, the 3 wise men, that actually means magicians. Astrologers is actually what those guys were. So like those guys in the Bible, these people would have been maybe used to predict the future, find things you've lost, find love. Maybe you're sick and you want to know why or get better. Or maybe you don't like somebody, you want to make them sick. That's called obsession. Or maybe you want to possess them, control them, and that's called possession, to bewitch them. And in a few cases, not that many, we do think there was actual worshiping of the devil. But that's probably not the main reason. But by the 1600s, any of this would have been seen as number 5. So why the witch trials, and why when? Because we don't really see witch trials before the 1500s. It's clearly influenced by misogyny, which is a hatred or fear of women. That goes all the way back to Eve. The idea that it's Eve's fault for the fall of man, for the original sin, and that plays out during the witch trials. Um, it's interesting. We sort of see competing images of witches back then and today. On one hand, witches might have been those people who are different. Maybe they don't look as good. Maybe they're hags. They live in the woods. Think of the movie Brave, and the witch lives in a little cabin in the woods. Maybe they're gay. Maybe they're single, widowers. Maybe they're just too masculine. Maybe they're smart. Maybe for whatever reason they're different from mainstream society. And so they may be considered a witch. And in some cases they really might have been herbalist or cunning women or somebody you would have gone to for a device or something. And again, you look at the modern portrayals of witches and it kind of fits this. But at the same time, back then and today, there's also this element of sexuality with witches. Of course, a woman exerting sexual authority or sexual desire back then would have been seen as something to fear. And I don't think you can get beyond the image of the witch and the broomstick, which even today, I mean, I think, for instance, in this pinup photo from the 50s, there's clearly a sexual connotation there. Um, and I think it's always been there a little bit. This is the earliest known image of witches on a broomstick from 1440s, from the margins of an old book. Um, there does seem to be a historical reason for this. And it's, again, we're not positive, but there was an old practice. If you wanted someone to come in and make your field fertile, your farmer, you would bring a couple of these wise women in, and they would use a broom to paint belladonna, or deadly nightshade as it was sometimes called, a paste from this plant. And it would cause them to hallucinate, and they would fly. So that flying and broomsticks, that seems to be where that comes from. So when you're watching Harry Potter, that's the origins of it. By the late 1500s and 1600s, the devil and witches, or male and female, are shown flying around on brooms and such. But again, if you look at the witch trials and the books about witch trials, there's always this element of sex there, and especially with women. And again, it seems to be anything that happens in a restrictive society gets chalked up to the devil. There was a very real belief in the devil, I think much more than today, that you have to keep in mind. I'll give you examples in Scotland of this, but they really do believe in the devil. Now, the devil as an entity changed. If you look at early Christian writers, the devil was a minor figure. Even in the Bible, he's barely there. The serpent's not even the devil necessarily. He's a trickster figure. He talks to you, he tempts you, doesn't have any power. By the time of the 1500s, that has changed. The Protestant Reformation starts to hint that maybe there's more evil out there than we realize. The New World with all these Native Americans, maybe that's hinting at something. So suddenly the devil is seen as almost an equal to God, a powerful figure, a dark version of God. But again, the early church didn't believe that. In fact, St. Augustine said witchcraft is impossible. That's blasphemy to say that anything other than God has power. But that changed. A lot of this does seem to be taking these pagan beliefs that once existed and still existed as superstitions and converting all of that to the devil. For instance, Pan, an early pagan belief, going back to the Romans. I mean, he looks like often the modern view of the devil today. But this idea of the New World and the Indians there, who are they worshiping if they're not worshiping God? And once they've been exposed to Christianity, why aren't they all Christians now? Because they all weren't. So a lot of people thought the New World was where the devil was alive. And of course, these fears were very much expanded with very real problems like Indian wars between Indians and the English. And of course, a lot of the Indians in New England became Catholic Christians with the French. So for the English, oh my gosh, that's the worst thing ever. Even the Salem witch trials, the last witch trials in the Americas in 1692 and 93, if you read the original descriptions from the little girls who were hallucinating and convulsing, that movies always portray as faking it. Today we think they were really, truly convulsing, probably post-traumatic stress syndrome. And what they describe, this dark man coming into the rooms, they're really describing an Indian, if you really read the descriptions. In fact, if you look at those initial girls who had visions, Every one of them had either been kidnapped by a Native American at one point or knew somebody that did. And that seems to be kind of the answer to the Salem witch trials, by the way. There's social tension, especially as overpopulation and stuff we talked about at the crisis of the 1500s and the Protestant Reformation. And then those earlier misunderstandings of Christianity, like Jesus magic, or what Catholics are doing versus what Protestants are doing. So all of this kind of comes together to create the witch craze. Now we talk about covens, and we'll talk more about this in Scotland. But coven, by the way, means agreement and a meeting. Even today we talk about a religion, God, a covenant with God. Protestants talk about a covenant with God. And what happens with the devil is supposed to be just the same thing that happens in a church. It's the devil. So you would meet, you would talk, you would make a deal, you'd seal your pact with a kiss, or signing your name in blood, or kissing the devil on his ass, or something of that nature. You would dance, you'd drink, you'd have sex without shame. During that sex, the devil might leave his mark on you, on your forehead. He might grab you, he might bite you, and he might even rebaptize you, might even give you a new name. What's interesting is these stories describe a lot of fun. The devil's often portrayed as wearing black or wearing green, as a handsome person, and it seems like a big party. To some degree, it may be people living in a very restrictive society, doing something bad, to them bad, drinking, getting drunk, having sex, and then looking back on it going, oh no, I shouldn't have done that. The devil made me do it. This might explain why so many people actually confess to this. They may have really convinced themselves that they actually saw the devil and met with the devil. Here's an early image from the 1600s of somebody being rebaptized by the devil. Here's somebody sealing the deal with the devil by kissing the devil on the rear end. Of course, what you do with witches, you're not supposed to suffer a witch to live, so they would be hung or pressed or burned. And in Scotland, they were usually burned. We'll see the spots where they were burned. And we see this reflected in Harry Potter. Harry Potter very much is a struggle between muggles and the witches. And, they have to keep it hidden. They can't go away. Of course, I've given you a chapter from Harry Potter history that I hope you have read or will read that deals a lot with this. And, of course, the big story in Harry Potter, the long story is Voldemort, the bad guy, the snake, wanting to reestablish witchcraft. Not the devil, though, but the witchcraft, and not have to hide it anymore, be able to come out. And so in some ways, J.K. Rowling's taking these witch trials and the suppression of these herbal beliefs. And she said, well, what if magic was real instead of just being herbal superstitions and folk superstitions? What if they were real and they've been suppressed and they had to go into hiding? All different kinds of ways to torture a witch or to discover a witch, swimming a witch, or might throw them in the water. If they float, they're a witch and they die. If they sink, oh, they weren't a witch, but now they're in heaven, so it's okay. You would look for the devil's mark. It might be a bite mark. It might be a mole, a blemish. It might be a third nipple. Some people thought that you would grow a third nipple, females that is, so you could suckle the animals that surrounded the devil. That's what's going on here in Salem. You would find this because it might be a place that doesn't hurt or doesn't bleed by pricking the person. And there were people who their entire job was to go around and pricking people. We'll talk about that. That was big in Scotland. Some of these people would have been people of other faiths, Jews or Muslims. And you would have had to wear an emblem, a star for Jew or a half moon if you were Muslim. Even today, magicians are often portrayed as wearing stars and half moons, including Mickey Mouse. A lot of people don't realize that's where that comes from. If you look at Fantasia, where that particular cartoon comes from, the movie Fantasia, the sorcerer in there, he does have, without a doubt, stereotypical Jewish Muslim features that go back to these early drawings of witches. And Europeans very much feared Jews and Muslims because they didn't understand them. In fact, the original conspiracy theory is that Jews killed Jesus and they continued to kill Christians and drink their blood. And you see these Jews drinking the blood of a baby, and on the other side having sex with animals and helping the devil have sex with an animal. So if you're a witch, what do? You're accused. Well, you can run away. Good if you can do it. You could accuse somebody else. They made me do it. They bewitched me. That might work. You can get pregnant if you're a female. because they won't kill you as long as you have a baby in you. Hopefully it'll die off. The craze will die off before you're hung. You can confess, but you're going to die. At least it gets it over with. You can plead innocent. I mean, you're probably going to die anyway, but they're not going to believe you. They're going to torture you till you do confess. Or you can just refuse a trial. You're going to die, but at least it gets over with quick. So, not that many options. And of course, we all know this from the movies and such. These witch trials truly were horrendous, with all types of torturing and waterboarding and pricking and burning to get you to confess, and then they would kill you. In modern times, there's been this phrase, the burning times. That's very much kind of part of the neo-pagan movement. And this is where we begin to see some of the exaggerations come in. As horrendous as this was, again, we have exaggerated the numbers a little bit. Margaret Murray, an Egyptologist in the 1920s, wrote a book called The God of the Witches, and she wrote some other books too. She put forth the idea that this was a surviving pagan cult, that they weren't actually witches, but they were actually worshiping pagan gods, and that it still existed into the 20th century. And she wrote this book arguing for that. She also put forth the idea that literally 20 million women were killed. Those numbers are just astronomically wrong. And sadly, her book, which is an intriguing thesis that people still talk about today, didn't play out. She was looking at evidence that didn't seem. She saw some practices that were still going on in Northern Europe. She looked at some of the early records, and frankly, she faked a lot of it. I mean, this would be the story of witch trials until the 1970s, and when people went back and looked at the records and went, "Oh, she faked it." You know, she really, which sadly does happen to historians sometimes. They want to believe something so badly, they make it happen. But she's had a big impact on the modern world, because that's still kind of the story people say. Wicca, created by Gerald Gardner in the early 1950s, he was supposed to have discovered one of these early covens of neo-pagans, if you will. And he wrote a book, Witchcraft Today, which Margaret Murray wrote the introduction for, which began the whole Wicca neo-pagan movement. People who are now neo-pagans, I have a friend who's a Wiccan, actually. They're kind of aware that the origins of this isn't true. They still believe it anyway. They choose to believe it. So I don't want to knock them for believing that. But historically, most of the practices you see today really are from the 20th century and really probably had nothing to do with the 1500s and back. In Edinburgh, by the way. In fact, they're about to do this. I'm recording this on Saturday, the 27th. And so in 3 days, they're about to do this in Edinburgh. This is kind of a performance art Samhain, which is Halloween, the beginning of winter. Halloween actually is a Christian holiday, but it's based on an earlier practice of when winter came, Samhain, and then Beltane, which is what's about to be celebrated. It's the beginning of summer, and it's performance art. None of these people, I think, really believes this stuff. It's just kind of a cool, big performance art thing, and you can look at YouTube videos of it if you're interested. Anyway, with the scientific revolution, which again, so strangely happens at the same time. Because on the one hand, we see science, that's what we celebrate that today, rational thinking. That's going on in the 15 and 1600s. And then on the other hand, something that we today look at as horrible and completely backward and superstitious, and that's witch trials. And ironically, those were going on at the same time. By the 1700s, though, they do end. And we see the rise of true natural history and conservation. The idea that nature is important for itself. We see royal gardens, including in Edinburgh and Glasgow, where plants are planted and cataloged and studied. We begin to see what used to be called cabinets of curiosities, natural elements that people would put in their homes, elites, of course. And these evolved into the natural history museums that you see in Britain and Scotland, like the Hunterian Museum that we'll visit in Glasgow, or the National Museum of Scotland, which again comes right out of this natural history. So, 1700s into the 1800s, and really into today, nature is seen as peaceful, restorative. I mean, I was a park ranger. That's why people come to the parks to replenish themselves and to get in touch with nature. It's a place you go to get away from the evils of society. Instead of society being a haven from nature, now nature is a haven from society. We need to protect that nature. And that's part of God's covenant. There's that word again. In other words, it's a different interpretation of religion. It used to be we need to get away from nature. That's what God wants us to do. Get us out of that Eden. Now it's no, no, no. We're going back to Eden. We're rediscovering that. And that's part of our job as humans. And of course, that has affected science ever since. I mean, we now study nature and the stars and medicine and all that. And again, you can see this reflected in Harry Potter. Hogwarts is in a wonderfully safe, pastoral place. And when the bad guys show up, like in Diagon Alley in 6 and 7, it looks an awful lot like the early depictions of the Industrial Revolution. And of course, we see this garden movement, and you see this in Edinburgh, in Newtown. You'll see all these gardens that's coming right out of this period. And again, you think of where Hogwarts is, a wonderfully natural place. Okay, that's it.